This recording we've got now is going to correspond to your essay topic on World War One, and on there, I believe I asked you two things. One was why did the United States get involved in the war in the first place, and the second is how did the war impact the United States? And so I think I'm going to divide that up into two separate recordings because this would take a while. So the first one's going to cover the first half of that, that is why America was in the war in the first place. And the second one, which I'll record either today or tomorrow and put up shortly, should be how the war impacted life in America. And let's just start off by setting up the war itself. Right? World War One was a war fought between two sides. One side called itself the Triple Alliance. It was as the nations here in green. It was centered around Germany, the Kingdom of Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Fighting against them was a group that called itself the Triple Alliance. It is these nations here in salmon, or melon, or fuchsia. Right? It had a lot of different countries in it, but it was centered around three: Great Britain, France, and Russia. Entente, by the way, is French for alliance. Right? Why did these three groups fight each other? Well, it all boils down to the class that you had before this: new imperialism. That is, Germany was one of the losers of the new imperial. Well, it wasn't one of the losers of the new imperialism period, but it did not think it got a big enough cut of the world. And as we saw in your last class, if you're a big nation like Germany, you can't let that go. That is, by not having a big empire, it's a sign of weakness. It damages your economy. It makes your people unhappy. So Germany is going to be looking for a way to change this. And if you see this war over here, it's a war basically of Germany against the world. Germany is surrounded by enemies. Its only allies are countries that were losers in the new imperialism period. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire were powerful in the 1700s, but by 1914 they were also rans. They had completely missed out on industrialization. So Germany thought it needed an empire bad enough that it was willing to go to war against a combined power of everybody else who was worth anything. Right? And let's see how this war gets started. The trigger of the war is going to be an event that is going to happen over here. Where I'm pointing to now is a place called Bosnia. Bosnia in the 1700s was a province of the Ottoman Empire. However, the Ottoman Empire didn't industrialize. So over the course of the 1800s, it steadily started losing area. That is, all these countries over here in Olive and Bulgaria over here used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. They broke away during the 1800s because the Ottomans got weaker and weaker. Bosnia was another one of those areas that used to be a province in the Ottoman Empire. However, Bosnia didn't become independent like these other countries did: Greece, Serbia, Romania. Instead, Bosnia got absorbed by the neighboring nation of Austria. And a lot of the Bosnians didn't like that. So they wanted to break away from Austria and become a part of the nation of Serbia over here, because the people in Bosnia spoke Serbo-Croatian. They thought that they had cultural and ethnic ties to the people in Serbia. So they formed a terrorist organization to try to undermine Austrian rule and break away from Austria-Hungary so they could combine with Serbia. The terrorist group was called the Black Hand. The Black Hand was supported by Serbian military intelligence. Today we would call it a state-sponsored terrorist organization. They did a lot of spectacular acts around the world. And in 1914, they got a shot to do a big one. Austria-Hungary was a monarchy. Its head of state was an emperor called Emperor Joseph II. Joseph, however, had a son, the heir to the throne. It was the man you're looking at here. His name is Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand decided in the summer of 1914 that he was going to visit Bosnia. That is, the story that the Austrian government was saying was that only a handful of terrorists and kooks opposed Austrian rule in Bosnia. All the other happy peasants loved being part of Austria. So Franz Ferdinand was going to go to Bosnia to show the flag. He was going to go there, have a bunch of happy peasants wave at him, show the world that the Bosnian people loved Austria and that the terrorists were nothing. Okay? The Black Hand found out about this. So they decided when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand over here came to Bosnia, they were going to kill him. They ran this by Serbian military intelligence. Serbian military intelligence said go for it, gave him some equipment to do the assassination. Let's go over their plan. The capital of Bosnia is a place called Sarajevo. It is right about here. The Archduke decided he was going to take a train from Vienna to Sarajevo. Right? Once he got to Sarajevo, he was going to get in a car, and that car was going to drive him to City Hall in Sarajevo, where he would meet the governor of Bosnia. Right? The terrorists decided to kill him on the way. They were going to intercept his car as it was driving from the railroad station to City Hall and shoot him. This plan was made easier because Franz Ferdinand over here decided that he was going to publicize his parade route in the newspaper because he wanted a lot of happy peasants out there waving at him. And in order to make sure the happy peasants could see him to wave at him, he decided he was going to drive through Sarajevo in a convertible with the top down. So the Black Hand was ready for him. Their plan was to ambush him at a bridge. Sarajevo is full of bridges. They would have a terrorist with a bomb waiting at the bridge. When the Archduke came up in his convertible to drive over the bridge, the terrorist would throw his bomb into the convertible, and boom goes the Archduke. The end. So the Archduke in his convertible drove up to the bridge. The terrorist looked at the car, saw it drive up to the bridge, saw it drive past the bridge, and he didn't do a goddamn thing. He lost his nerve. But the Black Hand was prepared because at the next bridge, Sarajevo's bridges, they had a second terrorist. This one was hardcore. Not only did he bring a bomb with him, he also brought with him a vial of cyanide because his plan was as soon as he threw the bomb, he was going to swallow the cyanide because the Austrians would never take him alive and he would never talk. And to make sure that he wouldn't talk, after he swallowed the cyanide, his plan was to jump off the bridge and drown in the river below. So the Archduke in his convertible drove up to the bridge. The terrorist pulled the bomb out of his pocket and threw it at the car. The bomb hit the hood of the car, bounced straight up over the Archduke, hit the trunk, bounced off, and wound up blowing up in a crowd of happy peasants that were watching him, wound up killing about a dozen of them. But once he threw his bomb, the terrorist then took the cyanide out of his pocket and swallowed it. He didn't bring enough cyanide. All it did was give him an upset stomach. But that's okay, because the second part of his plan was as soon as he swallowed the cyanide, he would jump off the bridge, which he did, and found out that the water beneath the bridge where he jumped was 6 inches deep. He did, however, almost die because an angry mob of happy peasants who had just had a bomb blow up among them ran up to him and beat the hell out of him. However, he was saved by the police who brought him by, interrogated him, and he told them everything he knew, which is how we know about the plan today. However, they did finally kill him. They executed him 4 years later. But the Archduke is still alive. He, however, by now is pissed off. His convertible arrives at City Hall and he chews out the governor. He says, "What kind of a reception is this?" However, after that, he calmed down. That is, he realized a bunch of happy peasants who came by to watch his parade are now in the hospital. So he decided that rather than driving to the Austrian ambassador's house where he was going to plan to spend the night, instead, he was going to drive to the hospital and greet the happy peasants who are now hospitalized. So he got in his convertible with the top still down to drive to the hospital. And while he's driving, this man enters the picture. His name is Gabriel Princip. He was a 19-year-old member of the Black Hand. He was part of a third group of terrorists. That is, he just watched the events of the day where the attempt to assassinate the Archduke failed and he was bombed. Since he was bombed, he went to one of Sarajevo's many coffee shops to get himself a cup of coffee and cheer himself up. So he was sitting in that coffee shop. Meanwhile, the Archduke and his convertible were driving to the hospital, except that nobody told the driver where they were going. He was going to the ambassador's house like he originally planned. So when they told him he was supposed to go to the hospital instead, he stopped his car and backed up so that he could get on the on-ramp to a bridge. Syria was full of bridges. So Gabriel Princip is sitting in a coffee shop looking out the window. And what does he see as he looks out the window? The Archduke's convertible with the top still down, slowly backing up in front of the window. Beep, beep, beep. So Gabriel Princip decided to improvise. He came out the coffee shop, pulled out his piece, and put a cap in the Archduke's dome. He got carried away while he was shooting, and he wound up taking out the Archduke's wife too. Right? So now the Archduke is going to the hospital, but now for a completely different reason. His last words were, "Sophie, live for the children." Sophie being the wife, and then he died. She, by the way, didn't live for the children. She died too about an hour later. So anyway, now the head of state, the heir to the throne of the head of a state of a nation is now dead. Right? And everybody knows who did it because a bunch of the terrorists were caught. And everybody knows that the nation of Serbia was involved in it. So Austria responded by sending the Serbian government a strongly worded letter. This is what diplomats do. In the meantime, the German ambassador in Vienna over here came up to the Austrian government and told them, "You've been wronged, and we've got your back. Do not back down on this. Demand that the Serbs give us justice, and we'll back you up 100% of the way." Right? So with that in mind, the Austrian government sent the Serbs a bunch of demands. The Serbs knew that they were caught because, after all, everything was now public. So they gave the Austrian government almost everything they wanted. The Austrian government then went back to the Germans and said, "We're good with this, so I think we dodged the bullet on this one. There won't be a war." At which point the German government went back to the Austrians and told them, "You didn't hear us the first time. You are not backing down on this. Right? If you back down at all, then we're cutting you loose. You're now on your own, no more alliance." So with that, the Austrians rejected the Serb counter. And the next thing you know, Austria has declared war on Serbia. Serbia had a treaty with Russia, where the Russians said if Serbia ever went to war, the Russians would defend them. So once Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia declared war on Austria. And when Russia declared war on Austria, Germany, by terms of the Triple Alliance, declared war on Russia, which is exactly what the Germans wanted in the first place. Because remember, Germany wanted an empire. They thought that they did not get a big enough cut when the other nations divided up the world. Where they thought they would get their empire was they wanted two things. One was that they wanted a lot of Eastern Europe under their direct control. Was going to be their colony. In German history, Eastern Europe serves the same role that in America the Wild Wild West did. It was the great frontier. This was going to be the resources and markets that would fuel the new Germany. Right? So in order to get all this land that they wanted, they would first have to go to war with Russia, which they were now in. The other thing they wanted, by the way, was they wanted a common market for the west of Europe. where, I mean, sorry, a customs union, where all of the rest of Western Europe, especially France, would link themselves up to the German economy. So German goods could be sold in their countries without tariffs, right? And once Russia declares war on Germany by terms of the Triple Entente, once Germany, sorry, declares war on Russia by terms of the Triple Entente, France declares war on Germany too. So Germany is now in a war which positions them to get what they want: the common market, the customs union in the West, and all these colonies in the East. So why not just start a war in the first place? Why go through all of this stuff about manipulating this terrorist event? Well, they were worried about what people in Germany would think, because in the years before World War One, you had very divided populations in the big nations of Europe. They were divided between rich and poor. They were divided over ethnicity. They were divided over religion. They were divided between modernists who were secular and religious people who were traditional. And Germany was afraid that if they started a war, that their divided nation wouldn't follow them. German labor unions the year before World War One met up with French labor unions, and they both issued a joint declaration saying if Germany and France ever decided to go to war, let the rich people fight it themselves. Those the working people would stay out of it. So the German government is now in a position where it's a lot easier to bring their public now into the war, because rather than them starting the war in cold blood, they are coming to the aid of a friend, Austria, right, who had been wronged. This was something that was pretty well out in the open. Right? This does not mean that Germany was involved in the assassination of the Archduke. Okay, that was something that the Serbs did on their own. But one of the things history shows is that terrorist incidents are like streetcars, are like Ubers. If you miss one, there's another one that'll come by in around 5 minutes. Right? And Europeans are a lot more cynical about terrorism than Americans are, because they know that a terrorist incident, as soon as it happens from their history, can be manipulated by powerful forces to mean whatever they want. That's why when the 9/11 bombings happened in America, the European response to 9/11 was a lot more cynical than the American public response. Right? Anyway, so Germany is now at war with France and Russia. They were hoping that the British would stay on the sidelines. That is, Britain had a history of double crossing allies in the past, but this time the British were afraid of the Germans too. The German economy had been growing rapidly in the pre war period, so Britain hopped on the bandwagon. So now you have a war where the biggest nations of the world are all going to be fighting against Germany. A war that, by the way, Germany was pressing to start. Right? As this war is about to start, all these nations are optimistic that they're going to win. Okay? Remember, this was the period of social Darwinism, where they thought the ethnicities of the world could be divided into superiors and inferiors, and each one of these people thought they were among the superiors. Right? However, only one of these countries actually had a reason to be optimistic. And that was Germany. Although they were outnumbered and outgunned, they had the advantage of starting the war, of knowing the timing of when it was coming. And they, alone among all the big nations, had a plan over how to fight it. That plan was drawn up by this man here. His name is Alfred von Schlieffen. Schlieffen in 1912 was the chief of the German Army General Staff. Germany was a big innovator in all things military. That is, you go back 500, 1,000, 2,000 years, Germany's principal export to the world was they would train soldiers and pimp them to nations that wanted mercenaries to fight. So Germany had a strong military tradition. The German army was always considered to be very advanced technologically and organizationally. Among their big innovations was the idea of a general staff. That is, in the 1800s, what an army would do is they take their senior officers and just give them commands in the field. But what the Germans decided to do was take senior officers, and rather than putting them out in the field commanding an army, they'd put them in an office back in Berlin, where they would think about the war that would come and plan it out. Right? This innovation is something that spread to the rest of the world. Today in America, you probably heard of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It is the American version of what the Germans had planned out 100 years ago. Anyway, in 1912, von Schlieffen here was the chairman of the German General Staff. So he sat in his office and looked at what the world to come was going to be. He saw from the political situation in the world that Germany was going to be fighting France and Russia at the same time. So he figured the best way for Germany to win that war was to concentrate all their forces on one of those two, France or Russia, and knock them out first. Once they knocked out one of them, then they can turn all their troops around and fight the other one. Von Schlieffen decided that the one they would try to knock out first was France. Why France? Well, France is small and compact in comparison to Russia. So the Germans were hoping that if they could knock out the French army, they could take over the entire country quickly. Whereas Russia, it would take a long period of time. Also, Russia was relatively primitive. It didn't have a good road network. Its government was disorganized. So the Germans figured it would take a few months for the Russians to get a head of steam under them, to get organized enough in order to fight the war. Right? The French, on the other hand, would be ready to go quickly. So if you want to knock one of them out, France would be the target because you would have time in order to do it, whereas you would not have time in order to fight Russia alone. And also, the Germans figured they would knock out France first because France was French. That is, the French had a long history of fighting Germany. It all ended the same way, with France going, "Je give up. I'll take our country, but leaves our wines and cheeses. Ho, ho, ho." So, Germany, under von Schlieffen, says we are going to concentrate on France first. However, the French are going to anticipate this. So as soon as war breaks out, they're going to send their entire army to the French-German border. And this is where von Schlieffen's innovations come in, because this was the plan he came up with. This over here is the French-German border. It extends down to Switzerland. As soon as the war breaks out, the French army is going to go straight over here. So what von Schlieffen's plan was, is the German army would, rather than going to fight the French over here, would instead invade the neighboring nation of Belgium. Belgium is this triangular shaped country over here. It was formed in the 1800s by the British, the French, and the Germans. That is, they all recognized that this was a strategic location. If there was an army here, it's pointed like a dagger towards any of these three. That is, an army here could attack any of France, Germany, or Britain. So all three of them agreed that there would be an independent country here that wouldn't be allowed to ally with any of them. Which meant that Belgium over here was pretty much defenseless. So von Schlieffen figured a German army would be able to overrun Belgium pretty quickly. And once it did, it can then cross the border into France from there. And Paris, the French capital, is not all that far from the Belgian border. So if the von Schlieffen's plan worked right, then the German army comes this way, crosses over into France, takes Paris, keeps on going south, and cuts off the entire French army over here. The French army will then be trapped. It'll be cut off some supplies, then you wait a few weeks, it starves itself out, it runs out of ammunition, it surrenders. In the meantime, you take over the rest of the country. Right? So von Schlieffen drew this entirely out. He even figured what the railroad schedules would have to be in order to supply the army as it went through Belgium. Right? And they war gamed this. They came up with detailed plans for all their military commands in order to fight this war. Fast forward to 1914. The war starts in August, the first shooting in August the 5th. And then, to the shock of the world, the German army invades Belgium. The French army did exactly what the plan anticipated. It went towards the border over here, and then it sees the German army coming this way. The Belgians, being weak, were unable to resist them. By the time you get to the end of August, the German army has crossed the border into France. By the time you get to the first week of September, the German army has reached this purple line over here. They're within 40 miles of Paris now. From their forward positions, they could see the Eiffel Tower. Right? The French were so desperate that they sent taxi cabs through the streets of Paris looking for men of draft age between 17 and 40. If a cab saw you, they would stop the cab, they would take you, put you in the back of the cab, and drive you to the front. Once you got to the front, you would get out of the cab, they'd hand you a rifle and congratulate you for volunteering to defend the Republic. And at this point, something unusual in French military history happened. The French fought a battle and won. Even they were surprised. They called it the miracle on the Marne being the river that they were fighting in front of, right over here. Why they won was because the Germans had the bad luck that General von Schlieffen died in 1912, 2 years before the actual war started. His successors at the head of the German general staff weren't as bold as he was. So they took away units from the main offensive to put on the Russian border in case the Russians were ready early. And they took away just enough from the attack that the attack died out before it could get to Paris. The French were able to regroup. Once they did, the Germans realized that they were now in trouble. If the French could come in behind them, they could cut off the entire German army and destroy it. So the Germans withdrew back to this violet line over here, and they tried to beat the French army to the North Sea. They figured if they could get here first, they could still turn around in this direction and trap the French army. The French, however, were able to keep up with them. And by the time you get to the fall of 1914, this violet line is now the front line of the war. And neither army is going to move for the next 3.5 years. That is, if you come by the summer of 1918, you're going to see the troops basically within a kilometer of this line. Right? That is, the war became a stalemate, a war where there are two equal sides that cannot move each other. Right? Why the war was a stalemate was because of the failure of imagination of the officers who were leading the war effort. Right? That is, whether you were English, French, German, or other, you expected the war to be fought the same way a war was 100 years earlier. Right? That is, your model for how to fight a war was a general named Napoleon Bonaparte. He led the French in the early 1800s. In Napoleon's time, the primary weapon that an infantryman would have would be a smoothbore musket. This was a gun that was wildly inaccurate. If you took a shot with that gun, you could hit, if you aimed at a man on a horse, your ball would hit somewhere on the man or the horse if you could fire from within 60 yards. Right? So, with weapons that were that inaccurate, the best way to fight was to line up like these guys here, shoulder to shoulder, where you would all come out in a nice straight line and shoot at the same time. That way, since each one of your individual weapons is inaccurate, the combined force of the volley would hit something. Right? And in Napoleon's time, if you did this, if you were brave, if you kept your discipline, you won. However, in 1914, they were not fighting with smoothbore muskets. The standard small arm by 1914 was a rifle. Right? A rifle is accurate, right, to 300 yards. That is, if you have a rifle, if you aim at a man 300 yards away, a guy with decent training should be able to make the hit off of that. Actually, if any of you are familiar with weapons, if you look at any of those rifles that were made in, say, 1912, 13, they were ranged up to about 2,000 yards. That is, the gun itself could put a bullet 2,000 yards away with accuracy. What the major limiting factor on accuracy was the eyesight of the shooter. That is, if you don't have optics, if you don't have a lens on here, a scope, then you can't hit beyond the field of your vision, which is usually about 300 yards. Right? However, from 300 to 2,000 yards, by World War I, you have this. This is the fully automatic water-cooled machine gun. This gun could get off around 600 rounds a minute. By the way, the standard rifle would be at that time a bolt action. So it would have 5 bullets in the chamber usually. A well trained man could shoot those 5 bullets and put in 5 more, probably in about 15, 20 seconds. This gun, however, could get up 1600, about 600 rounds a minute. And it fired so fast that they had to put in the bullets on a belt. They just fed them in, and you pulled the trigger, it just kept on shooting. It was fully automatic. It fired so fast they had to spray water on the mechanism to keep it from melting. The fact that the guy pulling the trigger couldn't see 2,000 yards away didn't matter because his bullets could get there. And all he had to do was pull the trigger and just spray an area. So if you line up Napoleon style and try to run shoulder to shoulder towards an enemy, you're about to get mauled. And then you get into the big problem. The biggest difference between Napoleon's time and World War I was artillery. That is, they came up with, by 1914 with guns that fired really big projectiles. These are some French soldiers with a 75 millimeter cannon. That is, the gun over here fired a projectile that was 75 millimeters in diameter. 75 millimeters is about 3 inches. They would fill that up with explosives. By the time you get to 1914, they had modern military grade explosives like RDX. You fire that at a point, you've got a hole about 100 meters in diameter where that point used to be. Right? If you fire into the air, you could cover an entire area with shrapnel, that is, with strands of metal that are flying around as rapidly as bullets. Right? These are providing a tremendous amount of firepower at an enemy army. By the time you get to World War I, this gun is already obsolete because the Germans have come up with an 88 millimeter cannon. They called it the Big Bertha. If any of you play golf, that's what the driver is named after. By the end of the war, the armies involved are using 105 millimeter cannons. Right? And these artillery pieces, more than anything else, are going to create the stalemate. Because as you can see by how this squad is working with this gun, how much trouble they're having with it. That is, these artillery pieces were very heavy. The only way you could really move them was by attaching a horse to them. And once you've shot up a battlefield, horses towing these artillery pieces aren't really going to be able to get very far very fast. So you're going to have a tremendous firepower advantage to the defense. As you attacked, you got farther and farther away from your own artillery and got closer and closer to your enemies. So their volume of fire is going to be getting heavier. This really doesn't change until you start getting motor vehicles that could pull the artillery pieces with them. You start seeing them towards the end of the war. So you wind up with a stalemate where both armies have a good enough defense that they could prevent the other side from moving. And by the end of the war, you're getting tremendous amounts of firepower. Stuff that was unimaginable before the war. For example, this is a German railway gun. This gun was so heavy that only a railway locomotive could carry it. They could line this bad boy up 20 miles behind the line, telegraph in coordinates to the gunner. He would shoot it and be able to put a shot on accurately and blow up huge amounts of people with it. So you've got a stalemate where you've got enough firepower that neither side can move. How the stalemate looked like would be something like this. That is, both sides, in order to protect themselves from the artillery, dug trenches, right, so that their men could be underground with some protection from the shooting that was going on above. These trenches were connected by zigzagging trenches that would attach horizontally to them, that would go behind the lines. This is where supplies and reinforcements would come in. They would zigzag in order to make it harder for an artillery piece to take them out. When artillery shell hits it, they could still get around off of them. The areas around the trenches became what they called no man's land. That is, they were bombed so heavily that nothing alive grew off of them. Right? That is, you just saw any kind of plant matter killed off by the explosions. So rain would hit in the springtime, no plants to absorb it. The rain would go straight down into the trenches. They had severe problems for soldiers about something called trench foot. That is, they would wind up getting fungi that would, in the moist environments, that would get on their extremities, and essentially, if you didn't catch it in time, it would wind up rotting away your flesh. They actually had to amputate feet because they wound up getting infected with these types of funguses. Right? So in these trenches, you just had corpses lined up everywhere. So they had rats the size of dogs that would come by and eat them. And everywhere around you would have looked, you would have just seen a bombed out wasteland. Right? Let me give you an illustration for what kind of firepower is involved in the stalemate. This is a French village that's about to get fought over. This is what it looked like before the two armies got through with it. This is the same village after they got done with it. That is, if you're dealing with that kind of artillery, this is the kind of damage you could do. And any place you would have gone in Europe in 1915, 16, 17, you just would have seen death everywhere. That is, the battlefield looked like this, and this, and this, and this, and this. Why I'm going into all of this is a long build up to your question, is that there was one nation, one major nation in the world that did not get involved in World War I in 1914. That was the United States, right? So if you are living in the United States and you see these scenes in your newspapers every day, do you want a piece of this action? The answer that was the overwhelming consensus of the American public was hell's no. Right? America wanted nothing to do with the war. Right? And this was a broad consensus you would have seen throughout the American public. The war was the major issue of the 1916 presidential elections. Both candidates promised that if they won, they would keep the United States out of World War One. The winning candidate was the incumbent president, Woodrow Wilson. His winning slogan was, "He kept us out of war," with the implication being that since he kept us out of war in the past, he would keep us out of the war in the future. So Woodrow Wilson won his reelection in November of 1916. 6 months later, the United States declared war on Germany. Right? So if you see a war that is a stalemate, where there is no glory, there is no opportunity for victory, it's not even apparent that anybody's going to win the war, why is the United States going to get involved in it? The easiest answer involves what you're looking at here. What you're looking at is a submarine. Right? The submarine is a boat that could travel underwater. There had been versions of submarines that dated all the way back 500 years ago. But the modern submarine started to come into existence about 1901. Every major navy in the world had submarines. The nation that had the most of them was actually Britain. They had the biggest navy. However, the nation that became the most famous for using them was Germany. Right? When the war started, Germany declared a policy called unrestricted submarine warfare. Right? And let me give you a little bit of background about it before we go into why this is important. Remember, the war is a stalemate. Neither side can move the other one's army. So the plan that both sides came up with to win the war was a strategy called attrition. That is, both sides said, we are going to inflict a lot of damage on the enemy. We are going to kill their people. We are going to cut them off some supplies, keep them from getting food, fuel, ammunition. If we keep going on up, we keep this up long enough, the other side will lose the ability to keep on fighting the war. So the other side will give up. This is why they were sending soldiers to try to kill each other, even though they knew they could move their enemy. Right? That is, they would get their men out of their trenches, attack the enemy's trenches, knowing that they would lose 100,000 men because they hoped that the enemy would lose 100,001 men. That is, as long as the enemy lost more than they did, the enemy would eventually give up. That was the only plan they could come up with. How Germany tried to execute that plan also was through the use of these submarines. That is, Britain and France over here needed war materials that came in from all over the world. So Germany would send their submarines out here in the Atlantic, and they announced that they would not allow anybody to send anything into Britain or France. So if any of your ships came in, the submarines would sink them. The United States was very angry about this. And why was the United States angry? Well, for one thing, this violated international law. Because under international law, the United States was a neutral. They could send ships anywhere they wanted. Right? And they said that the Germans, by saying they couldn't, were violating America's rights. Also, the Germans, by sinking those ships, are going to be killing a lot of people. Right? And let me give you an illustration of this. What you're looking at here is a ship called the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a passenger liner. It sailed regularly between New York and England. Okay? The Germans believed that in addition to passengers, it was carrying munitions, war material. So the Germans said, if the Lusitania sails again, we're going to sink it. And if you're on the boat, you're doing so at your own risk. Right? Under international law, if the Germans wanted to stop a civilian ship, what they were supposed to do was fire a warning shot in order to make sure that it stopped. Right? Once the ship stopped, then the military ship was supposed to send men on board and make sure that all the passengers on the ship, on the civilians on the ship, got to safety. Put them in lifeboats, take them on board their own ships. Only after all the civilians were taken care of, then the military ship could confiscate the civilian ship or sink it. The Germans, however, were using submarines. These submarines are too small to carry passengers. That is, the typical crew of a submarine was only about 20 people. The Lusitania carried 2,000 passengers alone, not counting its crew. But also, these ships are very vulnerable if they're on the surface. So if the submarine came up to the Lusitania and let the Lusitania deboard, that's a process that's going to take several hours. While that's going on, a British destroyer will sail up to it, look for the German submarine, and sink it. So the Germans gave orders to their submarines to shoot on sight. That's the unrestricted part of unrestricted submarine warfare. There were no restrictions on shooting at civilian targets, and there were no restrictions about having to provide a warning first or help the civilians get off. So, when the Lusitania sailed in 1915, a German submarine caught up with it off the coast of Ireland, put 2 torpedoes into it. The ship sank, killing several hundred passengers, including a lot of Americans. Right? So, from these events, you get a very straightforward story. The Germans violated America's rights under international law. The Germans killed American civilians. So, the United States declared war on Germany because of this use of submarines. Right? And the timeline does back that up. That is, you saw a deterioration of relations between America and Germany as the Germans used those submarines in 1915. The Germans suspended the use of submarines in the early part of 1916. However, they restarted using submarines again in February 1917, and then war was declared in April. So you say the submarines caused America to get into World War I. You have an answer that has some validity to it, and that is partially true. However, you also have an answer that's incomplete because there is more going on than that. And let me explain what I mean. While the Germans put their submarines out in the Atlantic, the British actually had the bigger fleet. That is, Britain traditionally saw that their national security depended on controlling the oceans. So they had the biggest navy in the world in 1914. What they did with their navy is they put it right out here in the North Sea. And they declared a blockade on Germany. As they said that nobody, civilian, neutral, whatever, is going to be able to come into Germany. That is what the submarines were trying to do to England and France. The German submarines are trying to do to England and France. The British Navy was trying to do to Germany. This British blockade also violated international law because under international law, if you want to impose a blockade, you have to shut down all of a nation's ports. Germany had ports over here on the Baltic Sea. The British Navy could never get to them. So all during the war, these ports were open. Swedish ships would come here all the time. So if international law is the only thing that is driving American thinking, America had just as much of a reason to go to war against England as they had to go to war against Germany. And there's the British blockade was just as illegal as the German use of submarines. You could say, however, that the German submarines is more important violation of American rights because nobody's dying as a result of the British blockade. All that's being lost here is money. However, the German use of the submarine is killing American civilians. This is generating an emotional response. Right? However, if you're a government, you know that this is something that is manipulatable. And let me give you an illustration of that. Let's go back to the Lusitania for a minute. About 20 years ago, a team of divers found the wreck of the Lusitania. I believe they were financed by Paul Allen, one of the Microsoft people. When the divers explored the wreck of the Lusitania, what they found in its hold was that it was full of weapons. The Germans are right. The English were smuggling weapons on passenger ships. But an interesting question to ask is how did the Germans know this? They had spies on the docks in America, but it's a lot easier for those spies to get information if the British don't try to hide what they're doing. That is, if they bring on explosives on their ships in box and crates that say danger explosives, right? Why would the British do something like that? Well, maybe they want a German submarine to sink a boat with a bunch of civilians on it. What do they get out of that? Well, they piss the Americans off. Britain remembers fighting for its life in World War I. It's in a war that doesn't have an easy end. So you could put the United States, the only powerful nation in the world that has sat out the war to this point, into the war. It helps your chances to win. And if you're an American politician, a president, a secretary of state, you should know this, right? So the submarines themselves are part of the reason why the United States is going to be involved in the war, but they're not the whole reason. Because the American president, the American elite, are in their minds dividing this into good guys versus bad guys. That is, they see the Germans as the bad guys in the war, and the British and the French as the good guys in the war. So they are excusing British and French actions, such as the blockade, while they're hyping German actions, such as the use of submarines or the invasion of Belgium. Right? That is, they came into the war with a bias. That is, big shots in America came in predisposed to seeing the Germans as bad guys and the British as good guys. Right? And why they would do that were important reasons also over why they wound up coming into the war and why they came into the war on the particular side they did, on the side of Britain and France to fight against Germany. Why? Okay, so let's go into now what it is that's driving that mindset. The idea that the British and the French are the good people, the Germans are the bad people. Well, one of the things that's going to influence this is going to come from the teachings of the great historian John Shaft, right? Who once said that even when it's not about the money, it's about the money. You know, they say that Shaft was a bad mother. This is true. What does money have to do with anything? Well, as soon as the war starts, the sides involved in the war, Britain, France, Germany, all of a sudden need everything. They need food, they need guns, they need ammunition, they need railroad ties, they need locomotives. Anything that can be manufactured or grown, they need in order to fight the war. They have drafted millions of men to send to the front, so they're running short on labor, so they can't produce as much stuff anymore. They are firing thousands of shells a day, so they always have to replace them with more. So if you're Britain, France, Germany, where in the world could you go to get stuff? How about from the one nation in the world, the one major industrial nation that hasn't gotten involved in the war yet? The one major nation that grows a lot of food that has it to sell, the United States. So the war generated a huge economic boom in the United States as these hungry nations that are fighting these wars all of a sudden need everything that America could produce. Right? The war, we'll go more into this in your next class, is going to generate one of the longest economic booms in American history. Unemployment in America is going to go down to 1.5% during the course of the war. So you have this massive demand for stuff in Europe. The stuff, however, can only go to one side. It can only go to England or France. Why? Because of this this British blockade. American ships by the end of 1915 can't make it through the blockade to get to Germany. The German submarines, on the other hand, were much less effective. American ships made it through the submarines all the time. And in 1916, in order to keep America out of the war, Germany suspended the use of submarines. So throughout most of the war, American business, American farmers had unlimited access to England and France. And England and France were buying everything they could make. The question then becomes, how do they pay for it? Initially, they pay in hard currency, gold, but they run out of that pretty fast. When a nation involved in war runs out of money, how can they come up with more money? They start to borrow it. So the British and French governments start selling bonds on American markets. They start getting credit from American factories, from American farmers. And the next thing you know, they have borrowed a hell of a lot of money. Let me give you some numbers here to show it. Before World War I started, the United States was the biggest debtor in the world. That is, various American interests owed $2.2 billion in American currency to the outside world, primarily to British and French investors. And by the way, this was almost all privately owned debt. The government prior to World War I actually did not really borrow a whole lot of money. There was not much of a national debt involving government debt. However, private investors borrowed a lot of money to build up America. The steel mills, the railroads, all of that stuff was built with foreign money. The war, however, turned America from the world's biggest debtor into the world's biggest creditor. And by the way, the amounts of money you're seeing here by the standards of the era were huge. $2.2 billion in 1914. If you look at it as a percentage of the gross domestic national product of the United States, is the equivalent today of about $1.3 trillion. That was how much private investors owed in 1914 to Europeans. The 6.4 billion in 1919, as a percentage of the US economy at that time, was $1.7 trillion. So what you see here is in today's money, a $3 trillion swing over the course of World War I. Right? Which means if you're an American big shot, one of those banks who has made loans to England and France, one of those big industrial companies who has sold stuff on credit to England and France, one of those big farm groups that has sold crops on credit to England and France. If you're a wealthy investor who want British or French bonds, you're now asking yourself a very interesting question. What happens to you if England and France lose the war? That is, if England and France lose the war, they're not paying back these debts, and you're out $1.7 trillion. So you, as a big shot, have a strong incentive in making sure that England and France don't lose the war. After the war was over, a lot of conspiracy arguments centered around this. They call it the merchants of death. That is, that America was manipulated by bankers, by big companies to go into the war in order to protect this investment. They actually had a committee in Congress investigate it. It was called the Nye Committee after a senator named Gerald Nye from North Dakota who headed it up. Uh, they found that this wasn't actually true, that there was no conspiracy to get America involved in the war. The impact of it was just a lot more subtle. That is, if you are an American banker, if you're an American businessman, if you're a big American farmer, if you're a wealthy investor, you now have a financial incentive to see the war as good guys against bad guys. The good guys are the people who owe you money so that you could get paid back. The bad guys are the people who will prevent them from paying you back. Right? And these people, businessmen, bankers, okay, big farmers, are people who are highly influential. These are the people who lead America. Right? They now have a vested interest in trying to protect Britain and France. So when they are looking at the world, they're going to see the German submarines as barbaric. However, they're going to see the British blockade as a nuisance, as an attempt by a desperate nation to try to save civilization. Right? So the the debts that are owed to America from Europe, from specifically from one side of the war, Britain and France, is one thing that is going to shape the mindset of Americans that the British and French are the good guys and that the Germans are the bad guys. One of the things that is going to lead them into the war. But that's not the only thing that is going to shape that perception. Another thing that's going to shape that perception is going to be diplomacy, right? By 1914, Britain and Germany had both been dealing with the United States for a long time, and both of them followed foreign policies for the previous 50 years that shaped the way that America is going to act. Right? Let's start off by looking at Britain. Okay? Britain in 1865 was the most powerful nation in the world. Right? They, in 1865, had a level of advantage over everybody else that is comparable to, say, the United States in 1945 or the United States in 1991. That is, they could afford to look at the rest of the world and just say, screw you, we're going to do what we want. Right? However, the British government was more forward thinking. The British government knew that in Europe they were surrounded by potential enemies. So they figured they wanted to build relations with other nations, nations that would be powerful enough to help them if they ever got in trouble, but far enough away that they wouldn't be a threat to them themselves. And so the British leadership developed a deliberate policy to build up friendships with two nations in particular. One was Japan. Right? Japan and Britain had a historic alliance that would go on until the 1920s. The other was the United States. Britain and the United States, up until this point, had always had a very tense relationship. That is, the American public did not like England. England and America had fought two wars, right, in the previous 70 years, the American Revolution and the War of 1812. Britain supported the Confederacy during the American Civil War. So patriotic Americans looked very down on Britain in 1865. But the British, however, decided they needed the future support of America. So they said that from now on, we're going to do whatever it takes to win the Americans over. No matter how humiliating it is to us, we are going to win American support. So let's see how diplomatically they pull that off. When the Civil War was going on, British shipyards built ships for the Confederacy. These were called commerce raiders. They were basically pirate ships. The Confederate government would run them and they would use them to hijack American ships at sea. The best known of these was a ship called the CSS Alabama. When the war was over, the United States demanded compensation for their losses as a result of these commerce raiders. Right? Actually, initially, what they demanded was Canada, as they wanted Canada turned over to the United States. But barring that, they said they would settle for cash. Britain was in a position where they could have just told the Americans to screw themselves, because after all, they were stronger than America. However, the British government made a business decision. The business decision was the relationship with America mattered more than the money. So what they told the American government was, okay. They set up something called the Alabama Commission, where Britain and America sent up commissioners that would evaluate claims. If you lost money to a Confederate commerce raider, you put your claim before the commission, and the British government would make it good. Right? And this actually, for if you were somebody who wasn't all that involved in government affairs, was actually kind of controversial in England. This is what this cartoon is showing you. There's the British representative Britain here, John Bull in the cartoon, is looking at this inflated America, where the real America is weak, but the Americans are making these huge inflated demands anyway. Right? But the British government, looking in the long term, is saying, we don't care that we can kick America's ass. Their future support means more to us than some money. So they paid off the Alabama claims. A few years later, there was a border dispute between the Canadian province of the Yukon and the new American territory of Alaska. Right? Canada at this time was a British colony. And this border mattered at this time because they discovered gold in the Yukon. Where that border was would determine who got the money from it. Right? The United States demanded that the border be drawn up so America got the money. The British government said, okay. They created a special six-man commission to determine the the American Canadian border. Of the six men on the commission, three of them were Americans, two were British, and one was Canadian. And every controversial decision made by that commission all went the same way. It was a 4-2 decision in favor of the Americans, where the three Americans and the British guy would vote one way and the two Canadians would vote the other. As the British screwed their own colony in order to make sure the Americans got what they wanted, because the issue to them wasn't as important as the relationship with America. In the 1890s, the British and the Americans had a dispute involving the nation of Venezuela. Venezuela borders a British colony called Guyana. Venezuela and Guyana had a dispute over where their border was. At the last minute, the Americans butted into it. They said that the Venezuelans should get their way. So what the British said was, okay, they redrew the border. 10 years later, there was a dispute over Panama. That is, America and England had a treaty that said if either nation built a canal in Panama, they would both build it together and they'd both jointly own it. In 1901, Theodore Roosevelt, the new American president, said, screw you, we're building the canal ourselves and we're going to own it. The British government responded by saying, okay, build that canal. So every time they had a dispute with the Americans, no matter how humiliating it was, the British government backed down. They made sure the Americans walked away from the negotiations happy. Because to them, it was the relationship that the United States that mattered, not the particular dispute. On the other hand, the Germans took a different route. That is, in the 50 years between the end of the American Civil War and World War I, Germany was a nation that was expanding in the world. So was the United States. And Germany and America butted heads. It didn't necessarily have to be this way. When the Civil War ended, Germany was actually very popular in the United States. German middle class people bought Union war bonds to support the war effort because they opposed slavery. Right? However, for 50 years, the German government basically threw away that goodwill by fighting with the Americans over issues that, in the grand scheme of things, weren't that important. Because every time the Americans tried to expand, the Germans tried to get a piece of the action. They did this, for example, in the Spanish-American War. The Germans made this big production when the Americans tried to take over Cuba that they wanted some concessions from the carving up the Spanish Empire. The Americans told them to go screw themselves, but the Germans did enough asking that they irritated important Americans. Germany and America actually almost went to war over the island of Samoa, where Germany and America both wanted to take over Samoa. They both sent navies to fight over Samoa. Actually, and war was only averted because a hurricane broke out that sunk both of their navies. As they both sunk ships, sent ships to Samoa, they all wound up at the bottom of the ocean. After that, they negotiated a deal, but the damage was done. So if you are an American who is interested in the outside world, if you're a banker, an international investor, a diplomat, a military officer, by 1914, you've had 50 years of the British telling you yes every time you ask for something. And you had 50 years of the Germans telling you no. So if you're trying to figure out who's the good guy in a war between them, Germany or Britain, and who's the bad guy, you are strongly predisposed to looking in one particular direction. And this, by the way, is a valuable lesson. That is, uh, I once read a statistic that among married couples, two-thirds of the arguments that they have are never actually resolved. Right? They just kind of end. And they end because both sides involved figure, screw it, what we're arguing about isn't as important as the actual relationship. Britain was thinking along those lines. Germany was not. So what do they get as a result? Well, by getting American support, Britain got America to bail them out in World War I and World War II. Germany, by not caring about the relationship with America, by emphasizing whatever they were fighting about, got half of Samoa. So in the long run, which one is more important? Half of Samoa or the 20th century? Samoa is a very cool place, full of very cool people. The Rock is from Samoa. So is Troy Polamalu. But on balance, you would probably rather have the 20th century, right? So you hey, in the long run, a lot of things leading up to the war that are predisposing powerful Americans to look at the British and French as good guys, the Germans as bad guys. There is the debts that the British and French are building up to the Americans during the war. There is the tradition of British diplomacy in the years before the war. But also, the Americans are going to see the British and the French as the good guys because the British and French are going to control the flow of information to America. And let me explain what that means. I believe I put on your terms list the term undersea telegraph. And what that is literally a telegraph that grows on the bottom of the ocean. By the 1870s, engineers figured out how to do this. They would take copper lines and wrap them up in waterproof cables. They would then use giant spools and just kind of roll them out on the bottom of the ocean. By World War I, you had a system of undersea telegraphs that connected the world. But if you look at the map over here, the bulk of the telegraph lines that come out of Europe all come from the same place. They all have a terminus that ends in London. Right? By the way, on the American side, a disproportionate amount of the telegraphs have a terminus that ends in New York. That's why in America, even today, New York is the big media center. That's where all the banks are, because that's where information comes in first. In Europe, London, even today, is the big media center. That's why all the big banks in Europe are in London. That's why, if any of you follow European soccer, all of the the British Premier League is kind of the big soccer league because that's where all the media companies are. If you play in the British League, then all of your games go on the satellite, so people all over the world watch them. Right? What this means for World War I, though, is that the British control the flow of information that is going from Europe to America. So what does that mean? Well, say you're an American sitting around in Cleveland. How do you know what's going on in World War I? And you can't just step out your door and watch it. You're going to know from the newspapers, from the media. How's the media getting information? Well, they got reporters over here in Europe that are sending in dispatches by telegram. So the dispatches are going to London. And from London, they're getting put on the telegraph, sent to New York, and from New York, the telegram sends them over to Cleveland. So you're the British government. Can you take advantage of this? How about if you censor the telegraph? So any information that makes your side look bad is not going to be allowed on the telegraph. Any information that makes the enemy look good is not going to be allowed on the telegraph. Which means that if you're sitting here in Cleveland, you're going to hear a very one-sided account of the war. Your newspapers are going to be full of stories of heroic British, French, and Canadian soldiers fighting against Germans who are raping orphans and killing nuns, or raping nuns and killing orphans, depending on what their mood is that day. And that really is one of the stories of the 20th century. If you can control the media, you can control the battlefield. That is, if the media, if you can control the information that is getting into the media, you are preparing publics all around the world to support your position, even without them really realizing it. And throughout the 20th century, sophisticated people took that into account. However, in our world today, this has really fallen apart because the way information flows is now completely different. Let me give you an example from it. There's a nation over here called Israel. Right? In 1901, sorry, in 2001, there were a series of protests in a place called Gaza. Gaza is an area occupied by Palestinians, populated by Palestinians that Israel is occupying. If you want to get information out from Gaza on TV, it has to go today through a satellite link. The satellite link is in Israel. So in 2001, the Israelis just censored the satellite. Anything that made them look bad wasn't put on the satellite. In 2009, though, there were more protests in Gaza. This time, the Israelis didn't censor the satellite. They let anything that you could film go on TV. What's the difference between 2001 and 2009? Well, it's an invention that probably half of you have in your pocket. It's called an iPhone. That is, in 2009, every Palestinian had a smartphone. So they just went out and videoed the demonstrations on their phones. They could then go home and put that on YouTube. So what the Israelis are finding was that the Palestinians were now controlling the flow of information. The world was looking at the demonstrations on YouTube, and they were thinking that since it's on YouTube, it must be true. Right? That is, they thought that uh, stuff that comes out of the formal media is manipulated, but they thought that stuff that was coming out of things like YouTube is accurate. Okay, it is what's the word that's the biggest cliche today? Not genuine, but uh, well, real is what I'm going for. But there's a word that people use for that. I just can't remember it right now. Even though that really isn't accurate either. Any of you know anything about photography, you know that with the right software, you could manipulate anything. And video off of a phone is as easy to manipulate as anything else. However, the Israelis found that since the Palestinian iPhone coverage on YouTube was all over the place, that even information on TV that made them look bad was better than nothing. So they allowed the free flow of information to come in off of the TV now. Right? So in our world where we have all of these different ways of communicating, okay, it's a lot harder to manipulate information than it was before, or you manipulate information through different ways. But in World War One, being able to control the flow of information through the telegraph, which the British could do, was something that was vitally important in sending the message that they needed sent, which was that this was a war of good guys against bad guys, where the British and the French were the good guys, the Germans were the bad guys. So if you're in America, you're hearing the same message all over the place. It's coming from your leaders. Right? It's coming from the financial community. It's coming from the diplomats who are involved in the rest of the world. It's coming from your mass media. And also, it's coming from your ideology. When World War One started, Britain and France were democracies. Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire were monarchies. Okay? This was just a coincidence. That is, this was the political workings of the governments had nothing to do over why they were fighting. But the United States is a democracy. And for the United States, it is very easy to see a war of kings against democracies as a war of bad guys against good guys. The one exception to this was Russia. Russia in 1914 was ruled by a king called the Tsar, and that king had absolute power. Russia was the most tyrannical nation in the world in 1914. However, in February of 1917, there was a revolution in Russia. The king was replaced by a democratic government. So when the Germans start reusing their submarines in February of 1917, the Triple Entente is an alliance of three democracies: Britain, France, and Russia. The Triple Alliance is an alliance of three monarchies: Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire. Although this didn't have anything to do with the war per se, it did shape in the American mind who the good guys and the bad guys were. This war became a war for democracy, a war for freedom. So you put all this together, you have an American public that by 1917 is prepared for a war against Germany. They don't want to be involved in the war, but they would see the war as a war of good guys against bad guys. So once the Germans started reusing submarines in February of 1917, and the American president responds by asking for a declaration of war, he has a public that is prepared to go along with it. And, and this war is going to dominate American life for the next couple of years. And how it's going to react on American life, I will deal with in your next lecture. So let me stop here, and I will pick up at this point on the next recording that I will do shortly.